Hey, guys, tonight, let me ask you something strange. If I told you that in 2025, archaeologists quietly stumbled onto a lost royal tomb, a place no one even remembered existed, would you believe me? Probably not. Tomb discoveries sound like the stuff of clickbait headlines. And yet, this one was real, hidden under centuries of rubble, sealed with a cracked slab, and inside, a lonely skeleton with just enough golden trinkets to whisper, "This was once somebody important." But here's the thing, no one could agree exactly whose bones these were. A forgotten prince? A sidelined archduke? Maybe even one of Europe's most inbred royals, left to quietly decompose in obscurity. And if that sounds darkly fascinating, well, you're in the right place. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and don't worry, there's no test at the end. We're about to drift into the kind of story that makes history feel less like textbooks and more like family gossip. Except, in this case, the family happens to be the Habsburgs, which means bizarre marriages, tragic children, and facial features that really shouldn't be passed down the line. Now, this lost tomb was tentatively linked to a half-forgotten man named Archduke Karl of Austria. Never heard of him? Don't worry, nobody else really remembered him either, which is why his tomb ended up misplaced for centuries. But Karl's family, his family produced emperors who thought horoscopes were better than military strategy, kings who married their nieces, and children who looked like they were designed by committee. Part 2, Rudolf II, the emperor who forgot to rule. Hey guys, still awake? Or maybe you're halfway there. Either way, let's gently keep going. Remember how I said Karl of Austria had a big brother named Rudolf? Well, buckle in slowly, because Rudolf might be one of the strangest emperors to ever sit on a throne. And that's saying something, because Europe's royal history is basically one long talent show of dysfunction. Rudolf II inherited the job of Holy Roman Emperor in the late 1500s, and on paper, it should have been glorious. He was the head of a vast empire, stretching across Central Europe, commanding armies, collecting taxes, bossing nobles around. The usual perks of being at the top of the dynastic food chain. But here's the catch. Rudolf didn't actually like ruling at all. He found politics exhausting, diplomacy boring, and meetings soul-crushing. Relatable, honestly, but unfortunately, when you're emperor, you can't just hit snooze on the state. Well, unless you're Rudolf. Because that's exactly what he did. Instead of ruling, Rudolf retreated into his private world inside Prague Castle. He surrounded himself with astrologers, alchemists, fortune tellers, and strange little curiosities from around the world. Imagine a royal court that was supposed to run an empire, but instead looked like the attic of a very eccentric uncle. And here's the curiosity hook for you. Rudolf collected mechanical toys that moved with clockwork gears. He kept cages of exotic animals, like lions and birds that terrified the servants. He owned paintings of grotesque faces made entirely out of vegetables and fruits, and he genuinely believed the stars dictated his destiny. So he delayed major decisions until the horoscopes looked favorable. Meanwhile, Europe was collapsing into religious conflict. Protestants and Catholics were at each other's throats. Nobles were scheming, and the Ottoman Empire was pushing at the borders. But Rudolf? He was hiding in his study, waiting for Mars to be in retrograde before signing anything. Now, back to our lost tomb. Some historians whispered that Rudolf himself wanted a private burial hidden away, almost secretive. But unlike Karl, his remains are pretty well accounted for, so the 2025 tomb likely wasn't Rudolf's. Still, his life story explains the family environment. Karl grew up in one where the emperor was too busy gazing at horoscopes to notice his own dynasty falling apart. But Rudolf's quirks went deeper. He suffered long bouts of what doctors of the time called melancholia. We'd probably recognize it today as depression. He'd lock himself away for weeks, refusing to eat properly, refusing to bathe, barely speaking. Courtiers whispered about his moods, but no one dared to confront him directly because technically, he was still the emperor. And then there's the dynastic twist. Rudolf never married, ever, which, for a Habsburg, was basically treason. This was a family that married cousins like other people collected stamps, and Rudolf just refused. He had mistresses, sure, but no official wife, no legitimate heirs, which meant the entire empire spent decades worrying about who would inherit. You can imagine the family dinners, his relatives constantly pressuring him, "Rudolf, when will you marry?" And Rudolf, probably poking at his salad and muttering about horoscopes. The dynasty couldn't survive without heirs, and yet their emperor was more interested in collecting unicorn horns. Yes, unicorn horns. Spoiler, they were actually narwhal tusks, but no one had the heart to tell him. So here's where Karl, or maybe tomb owner, comes back into the picture. Because Rudolf's refusal to marry or produce heirs meant the dynasty had to look sideways to his brothers, his cousins, and all their awkward offspring. Which is why Karl, despite being a minor figure, ended up with the kind of importance that might explain a gilded crown fragment buried with him. He wasn't first choice, but he was part of the backup plan. Let's pause here. Picture Rudolf's court in Prague. The corridors smell faintly of incense and unwashed robes. Servants carry trays past caged lions. An astrologer hurries down the hall, clutching charts that will decide whether the emperor gets out of bed today. And meanwhile, nobles from across Europe are waiting, impatient, outside the throne room, waiting for decisions that never come. It's chaotic, it's dysfunctional, and it's peak Habsburg. Now, we'll drift even further into the family web. Because Rudolf and Karl weren't anomalies, they were products of a dynasty that had already been experimenting with cousin marriage for generations. Which means the weirdness only multiplies as we follow the bloodlines. So, next, let's float over to their cousin, Philip II of Spain, a man who married 4 times, including one niece, and somehow ruled an empire where the sun never set, even though it frequently felt like the lights were off in his personal life. But before we get there, let's leave Rudolf in his castle, surrounded by stuffed animals, broken automata, and a throne he barely touched. A man so rich and powerful, yet so paralyzed by fear, sadness, and indecision, that his empire slipped away beneath him. And somewhere in a quiet tomb, his forgotten brother Karl was waiting. Part 3. Philip II, the Overworked, Overmarried King. So, we've floated through Karl's quiet little tomb. We've peeked into Rudolf's horoscope-obsessed castle. And now, let's drift sideways across the map into Spain. Because sitting there on the Spanish throne was another Habsburg cousin, Philip II. If Rudolf was the emperor who forgot to rule, Philip was the opposite. He ruled everything, all the time, to an exhausting degree. Picture this. Philip was responsible for an empire so large they bragged the sun never set on it. Spain, Portugal, the Americas, parts of Italy, chunks of the Netherlands, the Philippines, you name it. He had paperwork on it. Imagine the inbox. Actually, don't, it'll give you nightmares. Philip micromanaged every little detail. He read endless reports. He signed off on every decision, big and small. He once scolded an official for using the wrong kind of ink. Yes, this was the level of control. If Rudolf was hiding from government work, Philip was drowning in it face first. Now, here's the curiosity spark. How did this man who practically ran half the known world like a cranky office manager manage his personal life? The answer: badly, very badly. Philip married 4 times, and not in a hopeless romantic way, more in a royal family bingo card way. His wives were all carefully chosen for politics, which meant they were also often his cousins, sometimes his nieces, because, again, why waste perfectly good Habsburg DNA on outsiders? Let's go through them slowly, because each one adds a new layer of tragic bedtime soap opera. Wife number 1, Maria of Portugal. She was Philip's first cousin. Of course, they married when they were both teenagers. She gave birth to their son, Don Carlos, but childbirth nearly killed her, and she died a few days later. Philip was now 16 years old, already a widower, and stuck with a sickly infant son who would grow up to be one of the most dysfunctional royals in Europe. We'll get to Carlos soon. Wife number 2, Mary Tudor of England. Yes, Bloody Mary. Philip was in his late 20s. Mary was 37, desperate for a Catholic heir, and clinging to the hope of reversing England's Protestant Reformation. Their marriage was awkward. Philip didn't speak English. Mary wasn't exactly in her prime fertility years, and the English public hated the idea of a Spanish king. The whole union was tense and joyless, and of course, no children. After 5 years, Mary died, leaving Philip disappointed and still heirless. Wife number 3, Elizabeth of Valois, daughter of the French king. This one was actually a bit different. Elizabeth was young, vivacious, and according to gossip, Philip genuinely liked her, which was unusual. She gave him daughters, but no surviving sons. Then, tragically, she died in childbirth at just 23. Philip was heartbroken in his very stiff, royal, emotionally repressed way. Wife number 4, Anne of Austria. Yes, his niece. This one is always a record scratch moment. Anna was 14 years younger than Philip, and also the daughter of his own sister, which means that when Philip married her, he was both her uncle and her husband. Lovely. Together, they produced a handful of children, including Philip's long-awaited male heir, the future Philip III. Anna herself died at 30, worn out by pregnancies. So 4 wives, multiple tragic deaths, and a family tree that looked like a Embius strip. And through it all, Philip worked tirelessly. He sat at his desk late into the night, scribbling instructions, scolding governors, worrying over rebellions. It's said that his hands were permanently ink-stained. His courtiers joked he worked harder than any clerk in Madrid, which sounds noble, until you realize he was slowly exhausting himself into the grave. Now remember Don Carlos, Philip's first son from wife number 1. Oh boy, let's stir that curiosity, because Don Carlos was possibly the single strangest Habsburg heir ever produced. Paranoid, violent, half-blind, and the subject of so many tragic legends that he became a character in plays and operas. But before we tuck him in, let's pause on Philip. Imagine him in his palace at El Escorial. Cold stone walls, endless corridors, A study filled with stacks of papers, quills, and candles burning late into the night. 4 wives, all gone. Children sickly and pale. The burden of ruling half the world pressing down on his shoulders. And here's the irony. While Rudolf hid from ruling, Philip buried himself in it. Both men ended up isolated. Both were miserable, just in different flavors. Now, let's gently drift into the life of Don Carlos, the prince who was supposed to inherit all this power, but instead spiraled into madness, violence, and tragedy. The kind of air that made courtiers whisper, maybe the Habsburgs had finally inbred themselves into oblivion. Part 4. Don Carlos, the prince who terrified everyone so. We've floated through Karl's lost tomb. We've drifted into Rudolf's eccentric museum palace. We've sat with Philip too, hunched over his endless paperwork. Now, it's talk about Don Carlos, Philip's son, or as many contemporaries whispered, the heir who should never, ever have been allowed near a throne. Carlos was the child of Philip's first marriage, to Maria of Portugal, his cousin, naturally, which meant Carlos was the product of a genetic cocktail that already had way too many repeats. Even at birth, he was fragile, sickly. His skull had to be corrected with treatments that sounded more like medieval head squeezing than medicine. And as he grew, it became painfully clear that Don Carlos was not normal. Contemporaries described him as short, hunchbacked, and limping. His head was too large, his jaw misshapen, his eyesight weak. If he lived today, doctors would have had a field day diagnosing him with a list of conditions. But in the 1500s, the explanation was simpler. He was a Habsburg. Now, you might think, oh, what? Lots of royals were frail. Maybe he was just delicate. If only. Carlos also had a violent temper, not the kind of childish tantrums you can excuse. More like horrifying rages that ended with people bleeding. Here's where curiosity kicks in. Stories about Don Carlos include, he once tried to burn a servant alive, just because. He attempted to stab a stable boy with a knife. He chased women through the palace corridors, threatening them. He tortured animals for fun, and all this before he even turned 20. Imagine being a courtier, knowing this young man was supposed to inherit Spain, the Americas, and half of Europe. Sleep well with that thought. Now, it wasn't all his fault. His childhood was rough. His mother died right after childbirth, so he grew up without her care. His father, Philip, was distant and cold, more interested in paperwork than parenting. Carlos was raised by tutors who tried to discipline him, but honestly, what could they do? He was the heir. You couldn't exactly ground the future king. At one point, Carlos fell down a flight of stairs and cracked his head so badly that surgeons had to literally saw open his skull to relieve pressure. Amazingly, he survived, but afterward, his behavior became even more erratic. Mood swings, fits of paranoia, hallucinations. It was the medieval version of definitely not okay. Still, the dynasty couldn't just ignore him. He was the only male heir for years, which meant the court had to pretend he was a promising young prince, while privately fearing he might one day stab them in their sleep. His father, Philip, grew increasingly alarmed. Carlos started plotting wild schemes, like running off to the Netherlands to lead rebellions. He whispered conspiracies, made reckless plans, and alienated almost everyone around him. Eventually, it reached a point where even Philip, the ultimate workaholic king, couldn't ignore it. So in 1568, Philip made a decision. He locked his own son in the royal apartments. Guards outside, doors barred. Don Carlos was now effectively a prisoner in his own palace. The official story was for his health. Everyone knew it was really for everyone else's health. Inside his confinement, Carlos wasted away. He refused food, then gorged himself, then refused again. He tore at his clothes. He raged and wept. And after just 6 months, he was dead. 23 years old, gone. Of course, the rumors immediately started. Some said Philip poisoned him. Others claimed Carlos starved himself to death. Still others whispered he simply burned out too unstable, too unhealthy to survive. Whatever the truth, the irony was sharp. The great heir of Spain, groomed to rule half the world, collapsed into a locked room and died before his life even started. And here's where the sleepy contrast lies. On the one hand, Philip's empire stretched across oceans. Gold and silver poured in from the Americas. Spain seemed invincible. On the other hand, the man meant to inherit it all was so unstable, he couldn't be trusted with the dinner fork. Imagine the tension at court. Everyone pretending, smiling politely at Carlos while quietly stepping out of stabbing range. Nobles writing flattering letters about the prince's promising qualities, while privately updating their wills. And through it all, Philip working late into the night, probably sighing into his ink-stained hands, wondering how his dynasty had managed to sabotage itself yet again. The story of Don Carlos became so infamous that it spread across Europe. Writers turned it into plays, poems, even operas centuries later. Romanticized versions painted him as a tragic hero, imprisoned by a cruel father. The truth, though, was less romantic. He was dangerous, sick, and doomed from the start. So here's where we pause. Don Carlos never sat on a throne. He never ruled. He never marched into battle. But his short, chaotic life symbolized everything about the Habsburg dynasty at that moment. Power on the outside, rot on the inside. And that brings us gently back to our lost tomb in 2025. Because when archaeologists cracked open that chamber and found a skeleton with a warped skull and a crown fragment, some couldn't help but whisper, could it be Carlos? Was this the prince who terrified Spain, locked away, buried quietly, and then forgotten? Unlikely. Officially, Carlos was buried with pomp, but still tombs get moved, records get lost. History blurs, and the possibility alone keeps historians leaning closer. Now, let's float onward, because the Habsburg dynasty didn't stop here. If anything, they doubled down. More cousin marriages, more fragile heirs, more dysfunction wrapped in silk and jewels. Up next, we'll drift into the children of Philip's fourth marriage, yes, the one to his own niece, and meet Philip III, a king who inherited the whole empire, and basically handed it off to his advisors so he could nap.